This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
Welcome back to our study of the Gospel of Matthew. We're looking at the Sermon on the Mount, and we're noticing the authoritative teachings of Jesus. And the authoritative teachings of Jesus is that which is based upon chapter 5 and verse 20, where he says that your righteousness is going to have to surpass the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. And then he goes into what we're calling 6 contrasts. He's contrasting the teachings of the scribes and Pharisees with his teaching. Now, in the last lesson, we talked about the first contrast, and this was what that contrast was. The Pharisees were saying, do not commit murder. Jesus comes in and says, but I say to you, do not be angry. Notice the contrast between committing murder and being angry. And now we'll go into the second contrast, which is this. Do not commit adultery was what the Pharisees said, whereas Jesus is going to come in and he's going to teach, do not lust. All right, let's look at the text, Matthew chapter 5, beginning with verse 27. You have heard that it was said, notice again that he talks about this is something that you have heard, you shall not commit adultery. Exodus chapter 20 and verse 14 is where this passage is from. And of course you'll recall in Exodus chapter 20 that this is in fact a part of the 10 Commandments. And so Jesus is quoting this passage from Exodus, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, now we have the contrast, that everyone who looks on a woman to lust for her has committed adultery with her already in his heart. All right, the sin of adultery was a severe sin. It was something that was clearly condemned in the Mosaic law. But he says if you look at a woman to lust, you've already committed adultery in your heart. Now, what Jesus is saying is that if a person looks at a woman for the purpose of lusting, he has committed adultery in his heart. Now, God created the normal male to see the woman as a very attractive creature, and it is conceivable that a man would look upon a woman and have sexual feelings for her with his first glance. But this is where the Christian must draw the line between proper Christian behavior and what is not. If a man looks at a woman and he has these feelings of lust, he cannot continue to look, or he cannot look for the purpose of allowing feelings of lust to go on in his mind. The Christian has to cut off those feelings and no longer look at the woman that's creating the lust. If he continues to look and then fantasizes, then he's guilty of committing adultery in his heart. Nothing is sinful in the initial looking, because Jesus says that the reason that you were looking was for the purpose of lusting. And so if a person should happen to see a woman that creates these sexual desires without his knowing that he was going to be seeing her, then that's not what Jesus is talking about. Now notice the difference between the Pharisees' teachings and Jesus' teaching. They were saying, according to the letter of God's law, that it was okay to lust. Just don't commit adultery. It's kind of like look but don't touch. Jesus is talking about a deeper, more sincere spirituality or adequate righteousness than that. Now, when we look at these two contrasts, we come up with a good parallel. The first contrast, you shall not commit murder, Jesus says, no, don't be angry. Well, let's ask the question, who is it that's going to commit murder? Isn't it the person that has uncontrolled anger? So Jesus gets at the heart of the problem by saying, don't be angry. All right, who is the person that's going to commit adultery? Is it not the person who has uncontrolled lust? So once again, we see that Jesus is getting at the inside or the heart of the matter by talking about a person's sexual desires. If you do not lust, then you're not going to be guilty of committing adultery. We've got to have the attitude that was demonstrated by the righteous man Job. Job said in Job 31 and verse 1, he says, I will not look upon a virgin. I will not gaze upon a virgin. I've made a covenant with my eyes, he said. How then can I look upon a virgin? Job was one that simply was not going to let this happen. Well, when we look at what Jesus is teaching here and what Jesus is trying to emphasize about the purpose of lust, there's been some confusion, and individuals have supposed that if a woman, for example, catches her husband lusting, then that would give her the right of divorce, because adultery, according to Jesus' teaching in Matthew 19:9, is a legitimate cause for divorce. I don't believe, though, that this is the kind of adultery that Jesus has in mind, because he adds the phrase, in your heart. You've committed adultery in your heart, and that seems to separate it from the normal act of adultery. And this is not the same as, for example, the act of adultery, which requires two people in a passage like John 8 and verse 4. The sin of adultery requires the two to become one flesh, according to 1 Corinthians 6:16, and that's not possible with the adultery in the heart. Also, it's just logical that Jesus is not talking about adultery that would allow a person to put away their mate, as a result of lust, that is, because we could say, well, if that's true, then shouldn't anybody who has ever been angry, thus, according to 1 John 3, they're guilty of murder, that should they be thrown in jail because they got angry? I suppose that everybody that is watching these films right now will admit that at some time in their life that they have been angry. Well, should you be thrown in jail because you are angry? Well, that's not logical. And also, couldn't we say that every person has lusted sometime in their life to some extent? Well, and that would include women as well. Does that mean that husbands should be putting away their wives and wives husbands? No. Jesus is not pursuing that line of thought. He's going to talk about the putting away and remarrying a little bit later in the gospel, and even in the Sermon on the Mount here in chapter 5. But his point is the attitude of the heart. Men should be those that do not look at women for the purpose of creating and allowing these feelings of lust to go on. Now, we're not trying to minimize at all the importance of this passage. God is going to hold accountable those who lust. And to God, the sin of lust has the same consequences as adultery. It's very, very important for Christians to control their thoughts. For example, consult Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8. Then he says in verse 29, if your right eye makes you to stumble, tear it out and throw it from you. For it is better for you that one of the parts of your body perish than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. For it is better for you that one of the parts of your body perish than for your whole body to go into hell. Now, the Jews regarded the right eye and the right hand as the most precious parts of a person's body. And so Jesus is drawing upon that belief or that feeling by using the right eye and the right hand as his illustration. If your right eye, through lust, is going to cause you to stumble, then you're better off to not have that eye. If your hand is going to do things, touch things, steal things that it ought not to be touching and stealing, then you would be better off not to have that hand at all, but to cut it off and throw it from your body rather than to go into hell. I have an article here that comes from a newspaper out of Denver, Colorado, that talks about that a man chops off his right hand because the Bible told him to. And this was an individual, a 20-year-old man, who was reading this passage in Matthew, and he believed that he had committed some things in his life that with his eyes and hands that he should not have done, and so he plucked out his eye and he cut off his hand. Now the question that we ask is this what Jesus had in mind in this passage here? Well, certainly, this is not what Jesus is trying to say. That Jesus is trying to point out that it's better to lose the dearest thing in life than to lose one's soul. He says in Matthew 16, what will it be profited if a man gains the whole world and loses his own soul? So he's talking about the earnestness with which one should go after the sinless life. You know, a literal exaction of this, literally plucking out your eye, or literally cutting off your hand, would turn the church into a hospital. Everybody in the church at one time or another would have done something, touched something, saw something, looked at something that they should not have looked at, or touched something that they should not have touched. And so the entire church would be like a hospital ward. The Bible teaches in 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 22 that we should flee every appearance of evil. That's the key. Jesus is saying you should have the kind of zeal that you're not going to allow your eyes to cause you to stumble. You're not going to allow your hands to commit evil. Not only this, but we think about this from a logical point of view. If a person was guilty of lusting, and so they plucked out their eyes, would that keep them from lusting? Would they not still be able to conjure up thoughts of lust in their mind? So just getting rid of their eyes would not stop the problem. If a person had a problem of stealing, would cutting off their hands keep them from stealing anymore? Well, of course it wouldn't. They would still have the capability of stealing from someone. And so Jesus is talking about that your most prized possessions are not worth losing your soul over. Give your all to the gospel, to obedience to God. Do whatever it takes to keep from sinning. And so we would say then that this was a very powerful illustration and an exaggeration on the part of Jesus for the sake of emphasis to talk about just how serious a person should be about the sinless life. All right, let's go on then to the third contrast. Now this particular contrast that begins here in verse 31 is where the scribes and Pharisees were saying, if you divorce, go ahead and give the certificate, give the bill of divorce. Jesus comes back and says, but I say to you that you should divorce only for unchastity, or as we'll see, sexual unfaithfulness. Now notice the formula that Jesus uses again here. He's plainly dealing with the same thing, the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, in contrast to what he is saying. Now the Mishnah, which was Jewish writings that commented on and talked about the application of the laws of God, had a particular section or a tractate that was called Gittin. And that it had a section in there that was entitled Bill of Divorcement. There were three schools of thought that were found in the Gittin. The school of thought from Rabbi Shammai that taught that a man should not divorce his wife unless he's found some unchastity in her. Hillel said that if she burns a dish, he can divorce her. And Aqaba was actually a school of thought. Aqaba came a little bit later, but the thought apparently was predominant during the first century, that if he finds one fairer than she, if she find no favor in his eyes, then he could divorce her. We'll talk about these three schools of thought some more when we get to Matthew 19. But let's look at what Jesus is emphasizing now. The certificate, which according to verse 31, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of dismissal. That certificate was called a get, a G-E-T. This certificate was placed into the woman's hands, and this is what the get said. It said, go, thou art free to marry any man. And that's what Gittin, that's the tractate in the Mishnah, chapter 9, verse 3 says. Now this particular document, this certificate, this get, protected her from being charged as an adulteress if she should remarry. So Jesus is going to go then beyond the liberties that was provided by the Mosaic law. His teaching concerning remarrying and divorce are going to be far more rigid. The scribes and the Pharisees say, go ahead and divorce and remarry as much as you want. Make sure that you give the certificate every time that you do. What the Pharisees were saying then is in contrast to what Jesus was saying. There was no thinking about the sanctity of the marriage relationship. There was no thinking about the consequences. And so consider, for example, a passage like Matthew 19 and verse 9, where Jesus again is going to encounter the teachings of the Pharisees when they come to test him. There Jesus says that if anyone is going to divorce his wife for a cause other than fornication and marries another, he commits adultery. Well, when you look at that, it begins with, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for immorality, marries another, commits adultery. That goes along perfectly with what Jesus is teaching here in Matthew chapter 5. Now, there are some major points here that we want to consider. First of all, it's assumed that the woman will remarry. The husband that has exposed her to this fate must bear some of the responsibility for divorcing her. Because Jesus says, I say to you that the one who divorces his wife except for the cause of unchastity makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So he is assuming that the woman is going to remarry. But if he is divorcing her for reasons other than unchastity, that is sexual unfaithfulness or fornication, then this is not within the scope of God's law, even though the scribes and Pharisees from the law of Moses would say, if you are going to divorce, make sure you give her the get, give her the certificate of divorce. Jesus then is contradicting the teaching of the scribes and Pharisees by saying that divorce should not take place at all unless sexual unfaithfulness has occurred. Jesus wants the man who divorces his wife to think seriously about the consequences of the act. Whereas the Jews were following the letter of the law, God was allowing divorce, and so there was a giving and the exchanging of the get and the divorcing and remarrying. Jesus comes in with a far more rigid teaching by saying there should be no divorce except for the cause of unchastity. Not only that, but the man may very well force the woman into an adulterous situation. Because since Jesus is assuming that the woman is going to remarry, if she remarries without a God-approved reason, what does that make her? That makes her an adulteress. We look at passages like Romans chapter 7. If a woman marries another man while her husband lives, she shall be called an adulteress. That's exactly what Jesus is teaching here. However, if he divorced her for adultery, it would be by her own fault. And according to Matthew chapter 19 and verse 9, she does not have the right to remarry because she was, in fact, guilty of fornication. However, if the one who is putting away the other puts away the other because of unchastity or fornication, and then he marries another, that's a legitimate reason according to the biblical teaching here, and no adultery is taking place because the innocent person does in fact have the right to remarry. Well, it's conceivable if a man is prone to divorce and remarrying for illegitimate reasons, then he himself is going to find himself as an adulterer because he will be marrying someone else when he has no right to marry someone else, and he may end up marrying someone who was unlawfully put away by another. Now, it may very well be that the teaching of Jesus here is what prompted the discussion in Matthew chapter 19. Because as the scribes and Pharisees were listening to Jesus' teaching, they saw a definite rigidity of that teaching, a strictness in that teaching that was unheard of before, or at least not as powerfully as Jesus was teaching it, although the school of Shammai had already discussed many of these points. Well, what the Bible teaches, and we'll pursue this some more later, but in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verses 10 and 11, if you're a person who is divorced, according to that passage in 1 Corinthians 7, you have one of two options. You can live the single life, or you can be reconciled to your mate. 1 Corinthians 7 verses 10 and 11. Well, as I mentioned, there's more to say about that, but one other point before we move on. You'll notice that Jesus says, the last part, that whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Well, this shows that adultery does not break the marriage bond or the marriage covenant, because a person cannot be guilty of adultery unless they are in fact bound to another person by marriage. And so if a person divorces a person and then that person remarries, how can they be an adulterer or adulteress if there's no longer a marriage that's recognized by God? But see, that's the point. The marriage is still recognized by God. It cannot be adultery if she's no longer bound to another. Therefore, in the eyes of God, she is still bound, and to marry another would be to commit adultery. All right, let's move on. Contrast number 4 has to do with oaths. Or vows would be another word that would be appropriate here. Now here's the contrast. The scribes and Pharisees said some vows were binding and some were not. Jesus comes and says, you need to be a person of your word. Now, the word oath has to do with a vow or a pact. Leviticus 19 and verse 12 would be an excellent place to begin your study on this particular concept. What these passages are teaching us is that when you make an oath or when you make a vow, you had better do it. Because God is witness to the words that proceed out of your mouth, and He's going to hold you responsible for the things that you say that you're going to do. Now in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 7, it talks about not taking the name of the Lord in vain. This is not specifically referring to profanity or cussing. This is talking about you're swearing by the name of the Lord. You're saying, I swear by the Lord that I will pay you the money that I owe you. And then you don't do it. You've invoked the name of God. You've made a promise involving the name of God, which is not something that you've carried through with. Don't take His name in vain. Well, what Jesus is teaching here goes along with what He says also in Matthew chapter 23, verses 16 through 22. Because what they were doing is that they kind of had a game where a person would make a promise, and then the other person that they made the promise to would come back and say, you didn't keep your promise. You're a liar. The person would say, no, I swore by the temple. I didn't swear by the temple, but if I had sworn by the gold in the temple, then that would have meant something. If I had sworn by this as opposed to that, then I would have been obligated. And so you never knew whether a person was going to be true to their word or not. They would swear by one thing, but they would later say, well, that's not a binding oath that I took there. And so you had trouble believing people and trusting people on whether they were going to be honest or not. Jesus is saying, don't make false vows. Fulfill your vows to people. Fulfill your vows to the Lord. Don't make vows and then not follow through. Don't try to manipulate people, and don't try to manipulate things that you say to fit what you want. Read on from verses 34 through 37. But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it's the throne of God, or by earth, for it's the footstool of His feet, or by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great King. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. But let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no, and anything beyond these is of evil. Now there are some points that we need to consider here. First of all, Jesus Himself took oaths. He took a vow, and Paul did the same thing. Matthew chapter 26, verses 63 and 64, with Paul in 2 Corinthians 1:23 and Romans 1:9 and 1 Thessalonians 5:27, along with a number of other passages that are in the notes. What Jesus is showing is that oaths are ultimately referable to God. Whatever you say, that needs to be the way it is. We ought not to degenerate a society by having to swear to get people to believe that what you're saying is going to be true, and that's what you're really going to do. We need to be the kind of people that we don't need to go beyond anything other than, yes, I'll do it, no, I will not do it. And we're going to be people that are true to our word. We live in a society that we have to have signed binding agreements, and it has to be notarized and so on and so forth. There's so many stipulations that go along with the agreements because people cannot be trusted. Our righteousness needs to surpass that of the scribes and Pharisees. That's the way they were. They said, well, you signed this. Yeah, but I signed it with my left hand. I didn't sign it with my right. That's the kind of things that someone might try today. It's not binding. Jesus says, let your yes be yes. You say you're going to do something. Don't qualify it. Don't put stipulations on it. You say you're going to do it. Do it. If you say you're not going to do something, then don't do it. All right, let's then move on to the fifth contrast. This is one that begins in verse 38. It's going to run down through verse 42, and this has to do with revenge. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist him who is evil, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also. All right, so Jesus says you need to go the second mile. The eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, that was a part of the law. There's no doubt about that. But you need to have a better attitude than that. All right? Let's pursue this a little bit. Once again, we're looking at a direct law that came out of the law of Moses. This comes from Exodus chapter 21 and verse 24. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth line does come from that passage in Exodus. Now, the original intent of this passage and the original intent of this law was to get a person to think seriously about what they're doing before they do it. If in a fit of rage a person hits another person, then they're going to have to pay some consequences for their uncontrolled anger. Let's say then that a person in a fit of rage attacks someone else so that that person loses an eye. Well, the law of Moses was such that that person then, because he did not control himself, will also lose an eye. Or if by carelessly throwing a rock, a person causes another to lose an eye or to break an arm, then that's what's going to happen to him. The intent of the law was to calm people down, to get them to control themselves so that they did not do things to hurt or to harm others. The scribes and Pharisees turned this into a law of revenge. When anything happened, then they were really anxious to see this vengeance meted out. They wanted to make sure that that person got what they deserved. The intent of the original law was for the court to mete out or to give out by a recognized court judge an appropriate sentence. It was not meant to be given every individual the right of revenge so that they could launch out and start seeking their own revenge. Because what would happen was you have the Pharisees that are condoning revenge or saying that's a part of God's law. You have a license to get revenge. Well, not only was that not what God wanted, but it was also something that where people were not exactly fair. For example, say a person injured you and broke one arm. Well, your vengeance was to break both of their arms, and then you say, well, I got even. Well, that wasn't even. They only broke one of your arms. It was not intended to be a permission for an individual to go out and seek their own revenge. So Jesus says, but I say to you, do not resist him who is evil, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also. The word resist means to stand against. This doesn't mean to stand back and let someone kill you. This is not dealing at all with self-defense or a life-threatening situation. Even the law of Moses allowed a person to defend themselves in Exodus chapter 21. If you were being attacked, if someone was breaking into your home, then you had the right to defend yourself. But here is a person that is attacking you in some way. They're slapping you on the right cheek. That's not as violent an action as trying to kill you. There are legal ways to settle the dispute. You're turning around and punching the person in the mouth that struck you on the cheek was not the intent of the law of Moses. you want vengeance, then there are proper ways to have vengeance, and that is to pursue the law. Actually, though, in Christianity, there are two responses to have when someone mistreats you. First of all, according to what the Bible teaches, when someone mistreats you, you should be willing to forgive. In Luke chapter 17, verses 3 and 4, we have that disposition where we're willing to forgive. And then secondly, we're told in the Bible that we should let God take the proper revenge. In Romans chapter 12, verses 14 through 21, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. And then as you read on in the book of Romans, you see in chapter 13 that that's what happens. God authorizes the Roman government, or not the Roman government, but in that case it would have been, but he authorizes the government to bring about justice when someone has offended you or someone has broken a law and harmed you in some way. Jesus goes on to say, if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. So here's a person that wants to just wipe you out, to completely destroy you financially, take all that you have virtually. Still, the Christian should be maintaining an attitude with no revenge in mind. A society that is constantly seeking revenge is a society that's plummeting towards self-destruction. And this is something that's often happening today, where people are constantly suing other people and they're trying to destroy other people. They're trying to oppress other people. That's not the kind of attitude that should be found in Christianity. Instead, verse 41, it should be like this. Jesus says, and whoever shall force you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Now, Jesus is drawing upon a common event that took place in the first century. And that is that the Roman soldiers had the law on their side saying that their backpacks or the loads that they were carrying, they could constrain a Jewish citizen to carry that load. But the law said they only had to carry it 1 mile. And so the Jew who hated the Romans, especially the soldiers in the first place, would know exactly how far 1 mile was on either side of their house. And so as a result, once they would pick up that load and they would start carrying it, they had that marker and they knew right where it was that they were going to drop that load. They were only going to go 1 mile. And Jesus comes in and says, go ahead and carry it a 2nd mile. Don't you imagine that the soldier would have been totally shocked as you passed that marker and he goes, hey, your marker was right there. You've carried it further than the 1 mile. And you'd say, that's okay. I know that you have a long way to carry this load and I'll be happy to carry it a 2nd mile. You're not thinking about revenge. You're not demonstrating an attitude of hatred, but instead you're promoting an attitude of goodwill, of self-sacrifice, of selflessness. And that's what Jesus is saying, going the 2nd mile. Then he says in verse 42, give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. Now this is the positive side of giving, where before he's talking about one wants to take everything away from you by force, and that's the attitude that you have is you should not resist that person and create a violent situation. Now we have someone that's come to you in a peaceful situation saying, can I borrow some money from you? And Jesus says, don't turn away such a person. Here's a person that's in need. Don't turn the individual away. We're taught in the Bible that we should be good stewards. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 10, we're to give as we are able to the one who has need. Galatians 6 and verse 10, it says that we should give while we have opportunity. Ephesians 4 and verse 28 talks about that the reason that we work is so that we'll have something to give to one who is in need. The Old Testament law on borrowing was such that there was not supposed to be interest charged to money that was loaned to brethren. Leviticus 25 and verse 36, Deuteronomy 23 verses 19 and 20, and Exodus 22 verse 25. Jesus also talks about the same principle in Luke 6 and verse 34. If you lend to those who you expect to receive, what good is that? You're not doing favors if you're loaning money and charging interest to your brethren. So Jesus is saying you're doing the same thing that the Gentiles are doing. So don't turn away someone who wants to ask of you or wants to borrow from you. This is a giving attitude, a willingness to help other people who are in need. All right, let's move on then to the sixth and the final contrast. This will begin in verse 43 and will go all the way down through verse 48. This is contrast number 6, and this is love. The Pharisees said you should love some and you should hate others. Jesus comes in and he says you should love and pray for all. Now, there's something that's unique about this particular contrast. And that is, whereas this particular contrast, like the others, has its root back in the old law. For example, the first part of this comes from Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 18, where it says, you shall love your neighbor. Well, okay. But what's unique about this is the second part, you shall hate your enemy, is not found in Leviticus 19:18. It's not found anywhere in the Old Testament. And so the Pharisees had, in this particular case, went beyond what the law said. So Jesus, with his authoritative teaching, comes in and says, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. The word love here comes from the Greek word agapao, and it has the idea of a purposeful type of love, wanting the best for someone else. And so if you love your enemies, then you really want the best for them. This is not necessarily talking about a warm feeling of coziness and friendship and so on with them. But this is like 1 John chapter 3, verse 18. We have their best interests in heart. We care for them, we're concerned about them, and I would think especially are we concerned about their souls. There are many who stand as enemies of Christianity, many who are enemies of the Lord's church. The Christian reaction should be one of love and kindness. This is how Jesus responded to enemies, and so should we. We should love people and we should pray for them, and that's also what he says. Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. Now you're bringing the name of that person before God. You're on your knees in prayer, and you're mentioning someone who has made themselves an enemy of yours. Well, you need to help them, bless them, forgive them, just like Jesus did on the cross. He says, in order that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise upon the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. All right, so God blesses all, whether they are righteous or unrighteous people. The righteous would be God's friends, the unrighteous would be God's enemies. But yet God sends his rain upon them. He sends his sunshine upon them. So every single day, all people receive God's blessings, and that's an indication of God's love for all. Now, this is also a good passage to illustrate the supposed answer to prayer of those that are outside of Christ. People say, well, God answered my prayer. Well, God does good things for all people. It's not necessarily an answer to prayer. Blessings do not indicate God's approval of people. They still may be evil, as Jesus says, or unrighteous and still receive God's blessings. He says, for if you love those who love you, what reward have you? That's the way the tax gatherers are. And if you greet your brothers only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? That's the way they're acting. The key is in verse 28. Therefore you are to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. This is a passage that's easily misunderstood, but in the context, what's he talking about? He's talking about love. We need to love the way God loves, and we can do that. While we cannot live perfect lives, because all sin and fall short of the glory of God, Romans 3:23, we can love people the way God loves. We can love our enemies. We can pray for those that persecute us. We can do good to all men. because that's the way God is, and we can have that kind of perfect love, and that's what he's talking about here. All right, we'll continue then with our study of the great Sermon on the Mount, beginning with Matthew chapter 6 in our next class.